Disaster and emergency management in India. India is a large country in southern Asia. It's actually the seventh largest country in the world and the second most populous country in the world. Unfortunately, India is also one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to disasters. India's organizational approach. The way India organizes its emergency management has a lot to do with its colonial history. While it was a British colony, the Bengal and Orissa Famine Commission were developed in the 1700s to deal with a massive drought that caused a massive famine to sweep the country. On the Commission's recommendation, the Department of Agriculture was created, and they got responsibility from that point forward for droughts and famines. They actually still have responsibility over droughts and famines today. The implementation method in India is a top-down approach of emergency management. Actually begins at the center, that is the national level, with the National Disaster Management Agency. They then delegate resources and instructions down to the state level and then further to the district and local authorities. Disaster hazards and planning. Like I said, India falls into the top 10 most vulnerable countries in the world, and by some metrics, it is the most vulnerable country in the world. 58% of the country is susceptible to earthquakes, 68% to droughts, over 10% to floods, and the coastline, which is one-fifth of the entire country, gets direct hits from 80% of all the cyclones that form in the surrounding waters. There are multiple participants in India's disaster management process. The two that stand out the most are the governmental agencies and state bodies, that is national groups like the National Disaster Management Authority, and then state groups like National Disaster Response Force and civil servants. There are also lots of community actors that factor in, such as academic institutions, scientific institutions, and surprisingly enough, corporate bodies tend to form a big part of India's disaster management efforts. Again, there's also definitely international organizations like the United Nations that step in whenever the disaster overspills the bounds of the nation's resources. There are many obstacles to effective emergency management, such as ineffective government. The fragmented way in which disaster management is delegated within the government causes major issues, as there are many different bodies that need to communicate to get anything done. There's also a lack of resources and infrastructure, as much of the country is plagued by poverty and they just don't have the things they need to put in proper mitigation efforts. There are also traditional and cultural attitudes that form some sort of resistance in the populace towards mitigation efforts. They tend to not want to do things like evacuate or change where they're living to better protect themselves. Disasters have definitely helped to shape India's disaster management policy. Like I said, one of the first examples of that was the Great Famines in 1800s, where 13 million people died. Another more recent examples were the Odisha super cyclone in 1999, where 10,000 people died, and the Gujarat earthquake in 2001, where 20,000 people died. These earthquakes started the process of India including disaster management into their national 5-year plans for the first time. Later on, there was the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 that killed 200,000 people. This disaster helped to form the Disaster Management Act that created the National Disaster Management Agency in 2005. This was the first time they had one central body in charge of disaster management. Sometime after that, the body put out its first National Disaster Management Plan in 2016. This plan got put to the test with the most recent disaster, which were the Kerala floods earlier this year in 2018. As a result of these floods, 500 people died and 1.5 million people were displaced. Despite these unfortunate results, this disaster actually showed some improvement in terms of the disaster management efforts, because this was a success in terms of India's early warning system. Lots of people did get the notification in time to leave their homes, which helped to keep the death count low. From this point forward, India is still putting effort into working on their preparation and mitigation rather than excess focus on their recovery. And this involves lots of working on their infrastructure and putting in new plans to deal with the many different disasters that the country faces. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.